Hello and welcome to Transfermarkt TV. I'm Manuel, he's Stefan Bienkowski, and today's big topic is Leon Goretzka, the Bayern Munich midfielder, who, Stefan, looks like is for sale. And it looks like there's already some clubs interested in him, most prominently West Ham, of course, which in some ways is ironic considering that Bayern Munich were in for the player that West Ham is trying to now buy Goretzka for to replace, and that's of course Declan Rice, right, who opted to go to Arsenal instead. But this has been something that's been kind of bubbling under the surface for some time. Goretzka and Thomas Tuchel, of course, not on the same wavelength. Most famously, final match of the season comes on 14 minutes later, is taken off again, and then Bayern Munich, of course, win the title thanks to a late Musiala goal with Goretzka on the bench, and then he disappeared for some time because he was quite upset about all of this. Goretzka no longer a first choice midfielder next to Joshua Kimmich. Plan is to have Leimer there instead. And so obviously at the right price, Bayern Munich are now willing to sell Goretzka.
Yeah, it feels like this is going to be a long time coming to a large extent. Of course, it wasn't that long ago that Goretzka signed that new 5-year deal, I think it was, which still has about 3 years left on, if I'm not mistaken. So, we're not talking about a player here who's kind of winding out his contract by any means, but a lot's kind of changed at Bayern over at least even just the last 12 months, the last 6 months. Obviously Thomas Tuchel's come in for Julian Nagelsmann, who himself was the successor to Hansi Flick and supposed to kind of usher in this new era at Bayern and kind of refresh that entire squad. And Leon Goretzka just kind of feels a bit like he's kind of just this kind of a kite stuck in a storm of sorts around Munich at the moment. In the sense that, he's had a lot of managers. There's been a bit of a turmoil or turnover in Munich, or at Bayern rather. And I think perhaps most notably is the fact that while he himself as a player hasn't really changed a huge amount, we're not talking about a player who's drastically lost pace or suddenly become very injury prone. He's still only 28 years old, so it's not as if he's he's approaching retirement age. I think it's just a simple case that Bayern have kind of evolved or changed their squad to the extent that there's now not really the space for him like there once was. People who watch the German Bundesliga or maybe remember Goretzka from the national team, in his heyday or at his best, he's a kind of swashbuckling number 8. He's kind of running from box to box. He's fantastic going forward, but also has that kind of physicality to cause a threat in the air. He can defend very well. He's obviously got the kind of presence to kind of break down opposing attacks. But I think over the last 2 seasons in particular, just about when kind of maybe Hansi Flick moved on, there was a kind of real push to kind of, commit him to this kind of partnership with Kimmich in the middle of the park. And I think what that's kind of meant is it's kind of limited what he can do, because it's all well and good to be a number 8 and a kind of box-to-box player in a midfield trio when you have like a Javi Martinez or a Thiago Alcantara kind of holding behind you. But if it's just you and Kimmich, and we all know that Kimmich's got some attacking talents himself, he's a very good playmaker, it often meant that Goretzka was forced to kind of stay put. And, as a result of these last kind of couple of seasons, he's been a shadow of his former self, and doesn't seem as though Bayern are willing to kind of change anything anytime soon. They're not exactly going to kind of let him revert back to that previous role. So it feels like it's maybe best for him and the club if they just go their separate ways and he finds a club that lets him play his usual role.
Yeah, I think this has been some time coming, right? Of course, we all remember the pictures of Leon Goretzka emerging from the COVID quarantine that we all were under early 2020 as basically as the new Hulk with a tremendous physique, and that physique helped Bayern Munich power them to that famous treble, right? The tournament in Portugal where they won the Champions League, where he was such an important piece. And I think you're quite right pointing out he did this right in front of someone like Thiago, right? Someone who was able to really hold the ball for them and kind of dictate the play. And I think that is really an important factor here that's been lacking at Bayern Munich. So he hasn't really been surrounded with the players the team necessarily needs, and that partnership with Kimmich hasn't been ideal at times. Also because, as you mentioned, injuries have slowed him down. I think it's going to be really interesting to see where he's going next. He was previously linked to Dortmund. He has shut that down. He's a former Bochum and Schalke player. There's rivalries there that kind of makes you think, okay, not. He's only 28, so this, if he wants to go abroad, this would be the time to do it. And you look at where he would step in, and he is not an exact one-to-one replacement for Declan Rice, but he would perhaps fill that void in midfield. And if he's surrounded by the right players at West Ham, that could be a really good situation for him.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I completely agree with you. I think he is actually quite different from Rice in the sense that Rice is perhaps more of a kind of number 6. He can play that kind of holding role probably better than Goretzka can. But having said that, Goretzka might be really well suited to the Premier League and that kind of style of, playing that kind of box-to-box physical football. One comparison could be like, for example, Emil Højbjerg, who, didn't quite work out at Bayern Munich, but has really kind of forged a career in the Premier League at Tottenham. And it'd be really interesting to see if Goretzka could do something similar. Another club that kind of keeps kind of coming up in the back of my head right now is actually Barcelona, who constantly seem to be looking for central midfielders. They've kind of got the opposite problem where they've got Frankie de Jong as this kind of holding midfielder when they maybe actually want a more kind of box-to-box player. And, Goretzka, I'm sure, wouldn't turn down the opportunity to maybe play there, especially considering how much Real Madrid have bolstered their midfield. You'd think Barcelona might need something as well. So I think there's kind of plenty of options for him. Man United's another one. He's been heavily linked there for years now, but it's also worth bearing in mind that they're apparently going to be kind of moving Scott McTominay on at some point as well. So, if he can kind of come in and take his spot in the squad, then that might work quite well.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see what's going to happen to Leon Goretzka. Of course, you can stay on top of that and all the other news linking players to various Premier League clubs on Transfermarkt, in our forum, in the rumor mill, etc. Go check it out. Stefan, we'll be back soon with more content. Until then, cheers and bye-bye.